that you want to share, and especially since we have a smaller group, that way you can be a little bit more interactive, and I'll refer to my cheat sheet, I have the 4 tables here, so whoever wants to start. Excellent, thank you.
Maybe we'll start.
My name is Amy Winby, and were you just asking us to share something about ourselves?
Whatever, yeah.
I have a lot of grandchildren, and I love spending time with them.
Excellent. How many?
It sounds silly, but I actually have to count. Of our blood grandkids, we have 9, and then we have 6 that are part of our family too. So we have 15.
Y'all take it seriously, be fruitful and multiply.
Yes.
All right. Nice to meet you, Amy.
Thank you.
I'm Elizabeth Mock.
All right.
I teach high school,
What do you teach?
consult,
And what subject?
career technologies.
Excellent.
And I have a son. He's at Baylor. I have no grandkids yet.
All right. Well, nice to meet you, Elizabeth.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Liv Vance, and I'm retired, not because I want to be, but my company was sold to another company, and then of course they always say goodbye, so I try to do as many voluntary things as I can, because I know if I don't, I'll sit down and not get up. In fact, I had some neighbors I loved, and they had 2 adopted children, and they would come over and visit. And one afternoon, the little girl was 5, and she said, "Miss Lynn, you just sit here and watch TV all day. Now, would you know my house is a mess?" And I said, "Oh no, I do other things." And she looked around, she said, "What?" So I've tried to do more things, but not clean up my house.
She spurred you to action.
Oh yes,
All
she
right.
did.
Well, nice to meet you then. All right. How about back there?
My name's Corey. Still working. I wish I could see retirement, but I can't see.
No life to you.
Yeah, so anyway, I try to volunteer with different organizations. All of them have to do with kids. And so,
Great. Nice to meet you, Corey.
My name is Luz, and
Luz?
Luz. Yes. I don't really have anything interesting about my life.
How about something not interesting?
I work and work and work. I work at I'm a lending assistant at a bank.
Okay. Excellent. Nice to meet you, Luz. Either one?
Zach Griffin. I work for the Postal Service, and also go to school and take classes. I'm hoping to end up in medical school eventually.
Excellent. All right. Nice to meet you.
I'm Dara Hennings. I don't know what I was gonna say. I have 3 kids, all at A&M, and the oldest will graduate in May and start pharmacy school, so.
Excellent. There you go. Nice to meet you there. All right. Last one.
Hi.
Just share your name and whatever else you want to share.
Whatever else. I'm Julie, and I have a dog named Bella.
A dog named Bella. What kind of dog?
She's a mix. I adopted her, so I'm not sure.
Excellent. Those are the best kind. All right. So thank y'all for sharing that. And I'm George Cunningham. I've been at CASA since February, so not too long. I've had 2 cases. The first one was pretty quick, and had 3 kids, and the mom probably made a bad choice, and then saw the error of her ways, and went on the straight in there. And so the case got dismissed, and the kids went back with her, and then about the same time, there was, maybe a little bit short-handed, and so I got asked to do another one at the, kind of a little bit of an overlap, And this one, I think the parents probably made some bad choices as well. And so in both cases, the kids in the first and second one were born with drugs in their system. And so this one that I have now is a little bit good and bad. I think the parents ended up what's the verb I'm looking for? They gave up their rights.
Relinquished.
Relinquished, thank you. And that's always, I don't know if y'all have sat in your court observation yet, but if you see that, that's kind of a tough thing to see. And I think it was tough on them as well. The good part about it is that the kid's mom had done that, I think 5 other times as well. And so 3 of the kid's siblings from the mom's side were all adopted by one family, and it looks like, unless things just go completely haywire, that he'll be adopted by that same family. So he'll be with 4 of his maternal siblings, I think will be the term. So good, I think it'll end up good, but
How old is that, is he?
so he is 11 months now. Yeah, and the other one, the kid, by the time I got it, the case was probably 6 or 9 months, but then there was also, in the first case, 6 or 9 months, and then there was also a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old by that time, and a high schooler, and all had the same pattern, but we were with the mom. So hopefully she, I think I hope the last time woke her up to things that can happen poorly, unless she makes other choices. So she ended up moving cities, pursued a different career, I think. I'm hoping all that led to better outcomes. So I'm sure y'all have all those. Have y'all had your panel yet?
Not yet,
Okay.
next week.
Yeah. So the panelists will have much better stories than I do. But if after this you have any questions, I'd be happy to share, and Amy can correct things. Oh no, don't do that. If I say something incorrect. So in my job at A&M, where I teach and work in the director of the Center for Sport Management Research and Education, and then do some work in our graduate and professional studies office as well. And all of my research is in diversity and inclusion, and I teach classes in that. And so I bring some of that background, and I'll use some sport examples. So if you don't like sports, my apologies at the beginning, but then we'll apply it to CASA as well. And I will tell you, whether I'm talking undergrad or doctoral students or master's students, here's a common expression when we get to this topic. So, actual photo of how excited people get when talking about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Especially, I see this one quite a bit. Come on. So, why do you think that is so? I doubt y'all circled this on your schedule. Yes, I can't wait for this talk.
Sometimes tough to talk about.
It is, yeah. Yeah. All right, Zach, so it could be tough to talk about. Julie, what else?
Maybe we think we don't have prejudices, or we think maybe it doesn't apply to us. And
Yeah.
we
That's somebody else's
recognize it in
problem.
ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, so all of those, hello, how are you?
Oh, well.
So those and other reasons are probably, make people a little bit less enthusiastic about the topic, but hopefully, we get through and, identify ways that it can help you as a CASA. I think that's the key point here, or what I hope to get from it. And so, the academic in me likes learning outcomes and returning to the outcomes at the end. So, hopefully, we identify the different forms of bias and what we mean by bias. And then the impact on people who experience bias, and then even people who express bias. It has an impact on them as well in their health and well-being. And then ways that we can reduce it, which is probably most applicable to us. The academic exercise here is interesting to me and hopefully a little bit to you. But the real meat and potatoes will be in this, and we'll have a couple videos that we look through as well. So, when we talk about bias, sometimes people use that as a blanket term for everything. And that's fine in some cases. And just know that when we talk about bias, we're really talking about three things. We'll cover those three things tonight. Stereotypes, and I'll repeat this a couple times so maybe it'll sink in by the end. Stereotypes have to do with how we think about things, so our cognitions. And then prejudice is more of our attitudes, and so our affective component. And discrimination is the behavioral component. And all of those are bias. So when you hear implicit bias, then it really could be, people are probably talking about stereotypes or prejudice, and maybe not the behavioral part of it. But any of these can impact how we operate as a CASA, and how we operate with our neighbors and friends and so on. And as I was going through it, I thought about my own kind of preconceived notions and the way I interact with people, and it was helpful for me to rethink or reevaluate how I interact with folks as a CASA, or even talk about my cases with others, because sometimes I can reinforce pre-existing ideas that people have about the foster system or kids in the system, or maybe their parents as well. So let's go into stereotypes first. Here's the academic definition, but then we'll get down to what y'all think stereotypes are. So the traits that we view as characteristics of social groups or individual members of those groups, and particularly those that should have that, differentiate groups from each other. So we could break that down a little bit, but Corey, how about instead of this sort of definition, you tell me what you think when you hear about stereotypes.
Typical traits of certain people or groups.
Yeah, so how we think about certain people or groups, all right? And let's see here. Dara, you have anything else to add on that?
Not really, I mean, just, I think of just, you know, use that phrase or that word stereotypical blank a lot, you know, it's just what we've come to expect from, yeah, a certain group, athletes or, you know, whatever.
Yeah. So it doesn't even have to be based on demographics, it could be based on any group. So athletes
Sure.
do this, chemists do this, whatever.
Stereotypical, yeah, physics, you know, geek or whatever you're talking about.
There we go. All right, so just kind of how we think about different groups in general. An important thing is that they are what we call our culture and our time in which we find ourselves influences stereotypes that are most prevalent. And so there are some things, some stereotypes that maybe existed in 1950 that are different today. And if we think about, here's the sport example, so caution. There were stereotypes about who could be quarterback on a team. And for years there was, or even who could play on teams, but especially in a quarterback position, there were stereotypes about that may be better suited for white players and not for African American players. And in fact, there was a superintendent of an independent school district who voiced similar sentiments very recently and then got asked to not be superintendent anymore. But he was talking about the Texans quarterback. And so then the reason he got asked not to be superintendent anymore is because whereas that may have been common or a acceptable, in quotes, stereotype for people to express in the 40s, and by acceptable I don't mean that people now would agree with that. I'm just saying they did not face the backlash, maybe that they do now. So when you express that stereotype now, then it has the right, people respond harshly to that. So what are other stereotypes then, perhaps, Elizabeth, that may have changed over time? Can you think of any?
Think about working women.
Good
You know,
example.
it used to be in the 80s, they were power hungry, you know, and now it's just much more common. A lot of women, in fact, I think female college graduates
Yeah, so women even, like, what's their role, can they work outside the home at all, right? And then, what's their role in the workforce among working women? Yeah, good example. All right, how about, I didn't get your name back. Can you tell me your name?
Ruby.
Rudy.
Yes.
All right. Rudy, can you think of other stereotypes? Or that have changed over time?
I was waiting when you're coming straight up.
All right, I'll come back to
Oh, that'll be fine.
you. Zach?
So, let me see if I can get this straight. I think like kinda back when I was in school and then even before I was in school, like it was cool to like play sports and it, like if you were really smart, you were just a nerd and like, you know, I mean, nobody really wanted to hang out with the nerds, but and then like now I think it's like pretty cool to be really smart and like it's way more acceptable to be like an intellectual than, you know, back in maybe like the 80s or 90s.
All right. Yeah, so that reminds me of 21 Jump Street, the movie. Did you ever see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they had,
Oh,
he was picking on some people and said,
Yeah.
why are you picking on him? That's,
Yeah.
yeah, not acceptable. Great, all right, all good examples. So we can think about stereotypes again as the beliefs we have about different groups. There are some folks out of Princeton who developed a way to kind of group all the stereotypes together, and I think it will be applicable to our discussion here. And they suggest that stereotypes exist along two domains. One is competence, so people as a group are either seen as very competent or not. And then the other is warmth or likability or whatever term you want to put in there. They use warmth. And you can be very warm or not as well. And so if you group people in those different quadrants, that usually predicts how others will react. So if we think about quadrant 1, so people who are not very competent, but who are likable, happy, etc., then it could be the elderly, it could be people with disabilities. And in those cases, many times people will treat that group with pity instead of other sort of behaviors. So, and this is all based on studies. What's really interesting is the group's done studies around the world. And so, and the specific names that people use may vary, but these groups in general and the stereotypes people have of the groups are applicable around the world. And so when people think about elderly, there could be exceptions, again, based on culture and history, etc. But in general, high warmth, low competence. And you see some different examples in there as well. And so people who are on welfare, for example, seen as not very competent, not very warm. People who are seen as pretty competent but not very warm, stereotypically the rich, Asians, etc. And you see envy as a common response. And then in groups, if you look at the quadrant 4, is people who are like you, or like, people who are like you. And generally, people see others who are like themselves as warm and as competent. And so they'll treat them with admiration, respect, etc. And so we can think then about how maybe the folks we interact with as a CASA may fall into these different quadrants. And then how maybe not us, but others may stereotypically interact with them. So just hang on to that. We'll get to an activity where we explore that a little bit more. But we're trying to put in the back of your mind warmth and competence and how those can go hand in hand. So another thing about stereotypes is that those are common. So we could probably all name stereotypes that are common in the US. And they're expressed when it's normative or socially acceptable to do so. And that's the same with prejudice. But if something, let's say a culture or a setting, is such that it's not acceptable to express that stereotype, then people will generally make efforts to overcome that stereotype. And we'll talk about ways to overcome it as well. But that's important here, and probably one of the reasons that we have a discussion of this in your CASA training, because if you have stereotypes about any of the, let's say, CASA families or kids or people with whom you may interact, and let's say those are negative stereotypes, then you may be motivated to overcome those stereotypes. And there's a lot of evidence that shows when people are motivated to do that, and when they're around others who maybe fit those stereotypes, then the stereotypes decrease. Being around people who are different than you, we'll come to it again, is the cure-all, I'm convinced. Being around people who are different than you, even imagine people who are different than you, and that will decrease your prejudice and anxiety, research has shown. So that's one way to overcome your stereotypes as well. One last thing before we get to a quick group discussion is that stereotypes can also intersect. So if you think back to the quadrants for low warmth, high warmth, etc., we usually put one group in there. But if we think about me, for example, I have many identities. So I'm a dad, I'm a man, I'm, I was going to say middle age, I guess middle age, 42. My friend who turned 40 recently said he looked forward to the next 2/3 of his life, so that would not be middle age. But all those identities then can intersect, right? And how people see us and how we see ourselves. And so the same thing occurs with stereotypes. And if, a lot of researchers have shown, for example, that our racial stereotypes and our gender stereotypes can intersect. And so frequently, across a whole number of studies, if we think about masculinity and femininity, so Asians as a whole are seen as more feminine than whites and African Americans. African Americans are seen as more masculine than whites and Asians. And so you think, well, that's a fine academic exercise, but why does that matter? Well, it impacts the opportunities then that people have. And so we've shown in our research that among women coaches, African Americans are more likely to coach men's teams than they are women's teams. Again, consistent with that masculine stereotype. If you look at magazines and who's depicted in magazines, then that's frequently aligns with the gender stereotypes and racial stereotypes. So next time you pick up your People magazine, look at the advertisements and put some of this to a test. And then you can, I would suspect that you'll see if it's a stereotypically masculine product, you would not see an Asian model depicting that or advertising for that product. If it's a stereotypically feminine product, then you may see that. So all these things intersect. I use race and gender as examples here, but there are other identities and other stereotypes about those identities as well that can influence the opportunities people have, the way that we see each other. So I've already talked way too much, so it means it's time for a quick group activity. So I am a big fan of Think, Pair, Share. So think about these questions that are on here, and then pair up or get into groups of 3 if y'all want to at that table, and share about your responses. And then if you think you really hit a gold mine on some of the responses, then we can share out to the group as well after we go through these. So let's take a look at them. Think about the stereotypes of families you might encounter as a CASA. And are those stereotypes positive or negative? And where do they fall along the stereotype content model? So that was the warmth and the competence. And why do you think that is? And then how might these stereotypes affect your interactions with these families? All right, so let's mull on this for a second by yourself so you can develop your ideas, and then we'll spend a couple minutes sharing as a group, and then we can report out if you want to. Lainey, what happened?
So, yeah, sometimes you can, like, you know, how sometimes you think on it, you know, but then sometimes you're completely wrong.
It's always sad
Could
to
be good,
see.
could be bad.
And then like as far as like
Depending on the person.
yeah.
And I find that,
You know, if you allow them
I
to.
don't think that I feel any different about them. There is a huge difference in, again, the two cases that I've been a part of, education, jobs, that kind of stuff is much higher than on other sides. Education's not there. Poverty is something that's typical in the community place that I have.
Like, yeah, if you go in here or something.
I feel like I'll just view everyone.
Still say that it's less.
If she can give her.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think
I treat them any different.
Right.
I try to help them wherever I can.
look at the individual.
We live where we're
And
with
once you
foster
begin,
families,
once you see
and
these
so
individuals,
they've
it's
done a
very
fabulous
easy to
job
say like,
taking care of the kids, and so that's something that I'm worried about.
but then when the Lord comes and, you know, this
The
guy,
other side of
a
it,
father,
you know,
his son, his brother,
like
his
in
sister,
now, mother,
you know, they're people.
all that she
You
can
have
get,
to,
and she's receptive to that,
I
and
think that the only way to,
has done,
the only way
she's
that I
completed
have
all
found to
her
get past
services, and so she's working
that kind of
hard
life
to get her kids back,
is
right?
to see
And
the
so,
same as like with immigrant
you know, I
families,
appreciate
and you
that,
know,
and
they're not,
I
you know,
respect her for that,
yeah,
yeah, because she's
where
working
they come
hard,
from,
and so,
Guatemala.
Yeah.
that
You
has
know, but
much
they're
more to
desperate
do with
individuals, you
my
know.
feeling
So
versus,
there's not a good answer, but
you know, your education or
yeah, it's gonna have a negative effect if you.
any of that. It doesn't really matter to me. Are you working on stuff or are you not? You know, where does this case fall out? You know, in your
Try to
priorities,
understand
I think is kind of,
some motivations.
and I would say that that would probably impact
Listen to that.
more the way that I feel on the foster families as well. If they weren't taking fantastic care of the kids, I would feel differently about them. But I don't think that's, it kind of goes, you know, for me, it goes beyond the perception of motivation to,
She was very good because it was so,
they're
you know.
taking care of the kids, because the kind of people they are, they really do everything they want for the kids. If they were not that way, they would just,
It's not really in my control. Once the alcohol goes into my body, the physical stuff is happening.
So you can do that. This kid, but there's a bunch of, they do Casa Cafes once a month, Casa Cafe, goes to I don't know where I am, I don't think I'm at the 12-hour mark, so.
We're giving them all the time every day. I would be trying to make sure I don't go
For a living, I'm a maintenance guy for, a company here in town that's a power specialist.
People who sit there on the phone.
All right, how we doing?
Actually aren't.
Good stuff? Ready to share? Ish? Does anybody want to share? You don't have to.
I'll talk about it.
All right, Corey, what do you have?
I'll throw something out there to, and we were talking about this, for me, I'm not sure that, first of all, there's, in the two cases that I've been involved with, there's a huge difference between, the foster families and the families that are working services and trying to, on the other end of the case. There's big differences on education level, jobs, that kind of stuff, as opposed to, again, the 2 data points that I have, versus much lower education, the same impact on jobs and stuff like that. And the way that, I'm just thinking about my current case, I don't think I feel differently about those families. One, in our conversation, what seems to matter more to me is, kind of my perception of their motivation and stuff like that. I've got fantastic foster families, and they do everything for their kids and all that. And so that's a headache that I don't have to worry about. I get to go see them once a month and just check up with them, but I don't have to worry about if that kid's safe or being taken care of, because I know that he is. At the same time, the biological mother, she's worked all of her services, and she is working hard to get, her stuff taken care of so she can get her kids back. And I really respect her for that, because she's working hard to do that. And so,
So you may treat it more on an individual basis instead of as a group as a whole, is what I mean.
there's big differences, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think so. And on either side of that, if I had a foster family that didn't provide just off the chart care for these kids, I may feel differently about them. If they were just, just a bed, just a place,
Yeah.
I may feel differently about that, but, so.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Anybody else want to share?
Well, I just think that the nature of what we're doing, we're just going to be working with families that are in crisis. And so it would be wise as a CASA, to go into it understanding that, typically most of the families that have lost their children, it's because of neglect or, they're not being the parent they need to be. So I think what it says, are they positive or negative? And I kind of just thought, well, probably gonna be negative as far as what we're walking into.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're probably not their best selves at this point in time.
Right,
Yeah.
so kind of our goal is to understand that they're in a crisis, can't think of a better word.
Yep.
So, but I appreciate what you said about looking at both, foster family, are they doing a good job as well?
Yes.
So it's good to be just very open-minded, I guess, and not go in with, well, of course these people would have this problem.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people are struggling
Yeah.
with drugs and.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. I was glad you came in. So I was taught as a teacher, that was my undergraduate degree, is teacher training. Always wait 3 seconds after I ask a question until moving on. I think it was just about the 3 count.
Did I make it?
And most teachers, just as a quick aside, will wait 1 second. So any questions? Okay. I move on. But you can't possibly process anything, so. I also teach, as a quick aside, my stats class with my doctoral students on Tuesday nights, and I do not set a time limit on that. I will just wait until they should know by that point. So on the second week, they did not know that I would wait forever. Finally, they just couldn't stand it. It was 45 seconds, and finally one answered. She said, "I can't take it anymore." So now they know that they need to answer. All right, so stereotypes, thanks for the feedback. Remember, or y'all tell me, that's one component of bias. What's the second one? Prejudice, there we go, thank you much. So prejudice, again, is that psychological component of bias. It's the attitudes we have toward different groups. Anybody know who's in the picture?
I'm afraid so. It's a great example. I can't remember the name, but I remember the situation.
So the former owner of the LA Clippers, Donald Sterling, and he said some things about bringing African Americans to games and him not wanting his girlfriend to do that. And then the league invited him to sell the team after those comments came out. So that was a form of what we call explicit prejudice. And so explicit is whenever you have consciously harbored negative attitudes. They're deliberately maintained. It's negative toward a group, so it's not necessarily that you see your group more positively, but you view the one group in a positive manner. It's just a difference in positivity. With explicit prejudice, it's a negative attitude toward the group. We mentioned with stereotypes that this corresponds with the culture that we find ourselves. So I think most people in here would say, well, no, I'm not prejudiced against different people. But I would counter that. There are some socially acceptable forms of prejudice, at least in the US. Researchers have shown, for example. So would you say you had negative attitudes toward people who abuse children? Many people do. And that's a socially acceptable, again, form of, like it's fine for people to nod because people don't necessarily think differently of them. If they say, no, I don't like people who beat up kids. And there's a whole host of socially acceptable forms of prejudice in that regard. That in the US, it's okay to, from a societal impact, express that prejudice. On the other end, though, there are forms that are not okay to express. And so since 1945, it's been socially unacceptable to express racist attitudes. We still have that today, but in general, if you look at the people who, bless you, have asked on a survey, do you have negative attitudes toward this particular group, whatever that group is, then they would say yes in 1945, and it's decreased ever since then. Now only 5% of Americans will say on an explicit sort of survey that they hold racist attitudes. And so it varies over time across dimensions and context as well. That differs from implicit prejudice. So implicit is among well-intentioned people who hold egalitarian attitudes or fair-minded values, and yet still express prejudice in subtle ways. And that subtle way could be that you drive by somebody when they need help because everybody else is driving by too, right? Why would you stop? Everybody else is going. There's no expectation for you to stop when the 50 people before you pass that person already. It could be that you have just negative attitudes that you don't even know about toward that person, toward a group. It could be any group in particular. It could be the language that we use, how close we sit to people, All of those are ways that we could express that implicit bias or implicit prejudice. But again, the tricky part is we don't think that we have it. And that's the real kicker of it. So people who have that implicit prejudice, again, think they're fair-minded, but discriminate in subtle ways because of associations in the brain. So let's turn the page. If y'all are really interested, then you can go to a site called what's that called? Project Implicit, and it's on the last page of your handouts. And that's a site that Harvard hosts, and it will allow you to measure your implicit associations. Now, people who do it think, oh, this is not a measure of prejudice. That's fine for you to think that. Let me explain why the folks at Harvard think it is. We make linkages in our brain between an object and the attributes of that object. I'm going to move over. What's your name again?
Daisy.
No.
Daisy. Lou.
Daisy?
Oh, me? Sorry.
I couldn't see Daisy, so I'm switching
Okay.
spots here. All right. So between an object and the characteristics of that object. So when I see, for example, a Subaru, I drive a Subaru, my wife drives a Subaru, I think good thoughts about a Subaru. All right? When I see a, what's another car? El Camino. So this will provide a differentiation. I think good thoughts about the El Camino. My wife does not think good thoughts about the El Camino. I don't know what she has against it. But that object and the characteristics of it. And so I think about my thoughts toward the Subaru and the associations that I have with Subaru. But those are also embedded in my mind to where I wouldn't even have to necessarily think about it for that linkage to take place. And that's what advertisers kind of bank on, right? That's a reason why we have advertisements in magazines, on TV, etc., is to create those linkages. And so people hold those linkages about people groups as well, and we may not even know it, or we may not even think about it, but because of how we were raised, our environment, etc., then we all have different associations among the groups. So this is one of the page prints from Project Implicit, and you can go in and look at your own automated responses or linkages you have in your brain based on race, based on working women, based on a whole host of people and different groups. So the reason I mention that is because it's important to note that I would bet if I asked all the 10 people in here, do you have negative attitudes toward different groups, and listed off those groups, y'all would all say no. And I would also bet that of the 10, if we took our Project Implicit sort of test, that many of us would hold implicit biases toward different groups. We may not even know it. So the key then is to be aware that that exists and that there are ways to address that. So let's see on our next page then. The New York Times did a couple of videos that I thought were worthwhile, so we'll see if this works. I think there's an advertisement. I couldn't get rid of it first. We have volume, Amy, or?
It's on the wall, that one.
Yes.
Implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias?
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm gonna say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Alright, so, real quick. Alright, yeah.
Because throughout my life, peanut butter and
Didn't y'all want them to clean up that?
Yeah, I really did.
And then when they folded it, they had this little part there that was on the, it bothered me. Oh, you could retake it. Alright, so, what do we, think about the video? Any reactions to that video? Good, bad? It's fine to say, you know what, it's rubbish, I don't agree with it, but provide some rationale for why you don't agree with it. Luce, you're nodding. That's what you get
It's
for looking up. Alright. So why is it true? What do you mean it's true?
Because sometimes, like they said for peanut butter and jelly, we automatically think, oh, like even if you only have peanut, you're like, oh no, I want the jelly. It's on my sandwich.
Yes?
Even if you're not craving it or something, it's like automatically. Right?
Yeah. In fact, we were out of jelly the other day, and I thought, well, I could have honey with it. It's just not the same.
Right.
You gotta have jelly. Yeah. Alright? Anybody think, you know what, I get it, but I think they're stretching. It's fine if you think it. Well, y'all are clearly not in my class. I usually have hands raised with, I don't think so, Dr. Cunningham, here's why, and they let me have it. If you think on it, and you come back to it, and you think, it's been eating at me, I don't know that I agree with A, B, or C, then please speak up, because if you're thinking it, I promise you somebody else is thinking it too. Alright, so that's an example of implicit bias, and the last form of bias, in about 15 minutes of me, is discrimination, and just for our purposes, here, I think it's helpful to think about discrimination as differential. Inappropriate treatment due to people's social membership, but the treatment can result, or discrimination can take different forms. So one is access. So what are the resources you have? How much money do you have? What are the connections that you have? And then the other is treatment. And so are people treated differently based on their social group? And this moves away again from the psychological, from the cognitive, to more of a behavioral. And my sociology friends would say that discrimination has its roots in the way that systems are set up. So if we think about the justice system, if we think about the educational system, that those are set up to advantage some people, disadvantage other people. And then my psychology friends would say, oh no, it all stems from stereotypes and prejudice. And I'd probably say it's a little bit of everything. But wherever you come down on, just remember that it's differential treatment and differential access to materials, etc. So let's go back to our think, pair, share exercise, and again have that CASA family in your mind. And what forms of discrimination are CASA families, not necessarily the foster families, but the kids and their parents likely to experience? And then what can you as a CASA do to reduce the effects of discrimination? So think about it for a second and then pair up or get your trio and share out, if you will.
Not from us, but that's probably what they were, because all likely to this.
We wanted that to be released in high school. As it turned out, other than some testing, it's not a good thing.
I guess maybe feel like, because I mean, even as being a hospital and situation itself can be labeled as, you know, you're a hospital, yeah, no, we don't. So it's kind of trying to avoid, you know, try to do the most to help them, you know, have good home education. Because I was
Everything's
So, I mean, I don't know, law enforcement, there's some differences. There's no wrong answers. There's no good answers, there's no answers. But I think a lot of that, like, I think a lot of the things that are.
yeah, it's not one of my things, like what,
Just make it.
not knowing, how do they choose it?
Because it can be different access to discrimination.
So,
Actually, I think the statute
we got some information training for application and interview and stuff like that. We'll do another interview after this. And they'll talk to you. There was like a questionnaire that they kind of asked about you. But they're the last one to done something. people gonna do it now. So for me, because I work full time, they know, that it's actually a relatively simple case, because I just got that in, or, you know,
Like you said, it's
in this case, more
Yeah, yeah.
than the last one was just because the kids were in school and so and so, you know, I talked to the school, you know, she's in counseling,
And then also,
having more behavioral issues in school,
there was another 15 spots knocked out because they said those were limited. It's like, this is stupid.
Alright. Let's see here. Rudy, I'm gonna come back to you since.
Why do you wanna do that?
I had to skip you the first time and I felt bad. I wanted to give you a chance to share. So did y'all have any pearls of wisdom at your table?
Of course.
That's a rhetorical question. Any you'd like to share?
Just in regards to discrimination, one thing we were talking about had to do with access. And, sometimes because of the lack of access brings about more frustration potentially in the family, where the end result is that some type of abuse or neglect occurs. So we were saying that whereas at one point we did not have access, but now being involved in the system, if your service plan or the treatment plan identifies areas that will now open up doors in order for you to gain that access, even though the situation is not as favorable, if you can always turn a negative into a positive, and if you use it to your advantage, then it can potentially help to improve, the outcome and the end result, as we always say, being reunification, just because of taking advantage of what started out as a negative, but, taking those steps, so walking the steps to ensure that now that the door is open, you take advantage of, the opportunities that are presented to you.
Excellent, great example. And related to the access, y'all probably have in your binders, all the services that the county offers, whether it's 211, is that the?
It will get that.
So something to look forward to for your binder. But you can have that handy, and it's, because sometimes those services are not known. And then, when you have that lack of access too, it can result in short-term instead of long-term planning, and expectations for short-term goals instead of long-term goals. And one of the best books I've read recently, and Kate provided the training before, so I don't know if Amy would approve it, but yeah, y'all will have your professional development throughout the year. And Kate had approved reading Evicted for some of those hours, and I'm a slow reader, so that chews up a ton of my hours. But it's a great book about access and people who don't have access to housing, and especially housing that they can count on. And it's set in Milwaukee, where 1 in 8 families get evicted every 2 years. So let that sink in. Just think about your neighborhood, how many families are there. 1 in 8 would have some sort of eviction, whether forced or they're building up condemned or whatever it is. And everything that goes into that. But it's just a great book in general, but I found a lot of applicability to some of the things we were talking about when I went through training as well. All right, so let's go to a couple more things. One would be the outcomes of bias. And so similar to bias having 3 components, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, there's also 3 outcomes of bias. So one is physiological. So people who experience bias are impacted, their health is negatively impacted. And there's a lot of research on health disparities, and some of that is related to demographics, some of that's related to where you live, and some of that's related to access to healthcare. But all of those negatively impact people who experience bias. There's a really interesting study that came out just a couple years ago that also shows that people who express bias have negative health impacts. So it's not just those who experience it. So the study showed, and this was related to bias toward lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, that when people express that form of prejudice, they live 2.5 years fewer than their peers who did not. So it pays to be fair-minded. That's what I think that boils down to. Another outcome is psychological, and so the stress that comes with that. So if we think about the stresses we have in our everyday life, let's see who I haven't called in yet. Dara, I may have called in you already, but I'm going to call in you again. So what are just some daily stressors you have? Hell, I could rattle mine off like this.
You know, I don't have, food insecurity or anything like that. I mean, mine would be more like time.
Okay, so time, that's a stress. So time, what else? Do you worry about your kids who are in school? But
Sure,
your oldest kid will get into pharmacy? I was
She
gonna
did.
say- Oh, good.
Seconds last week.
So stress checked off, yeah, all right. So if we think about the stressors we have in our life, whether it's getting to the talk you're supposed to give by 5:30, which I did not, whether it's mortgage, whether it's your kids, whether it's your job, whatever it is, everybody has stressors in their life. And then, let's say you have on other stressors because of your personal demographics or being a part of a particular group. So when you experience bias, whether prejudice or discrimination or stereotypes, that adds unique stressors to your life. And so the researchers call it the minority stress model, but it just compounds it. And it's not necessarily additive to where you just keep on adding on and on, but in some cases it's a synergistic effect or a multiplier effect to where the impact of the differential treatment, let's say, or differential access has compounding effects on the normal stressors that everybody else has in their everyday life. And so it negatively impacts people's psychological well-being. And there's a study recently that showed that even 10 years down the line, it still can impact people's psychological well-being and physical well-being as well. And then one that I didn't list here, but if we think about people's workplace or relationships, et cetera, that also negatively, experiencing bias can negatively impact that as well. So you may think, well, that's great. It'd be like one of my students who said at one point, you know, Dr. Cunningham, it's important to study this, but this is a very depressing topic. And I can't study this for the next 3 years. And so she kind of shifted her research a little bit. But I think it's important to have that base to then understand what can we do to reduce our bias. So one perspective is comes out from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Patricia Devine and her colleagues have set up a 5-step process related to reducing bias. So there's a couple things related to this, and y'all can all read, so I'm not going to read it to you, but the key point is to have some awareness about yourself and your biases, and then to take steps to reduce those. And it's not a one-time thing. So if you think I went through and listened to that guy in CASA training for an hour and a half, check, I'm done with my bias training, you're going to be disappointed. Even more disappointed than at the end of this lesson here. And so it's a continuous thing. And one thing that we can do to continually be mindful of that is perspective taking. I guess two things. Perspective taking, which we see here, and not only just thinking about those who experience bias, but have some empathy about it. So putting yourself in the other's shoes, and being around others who are not like you. Again, just the thing that I think people have shown for about 70 years, that being around people who are not like you, whether it's ability, whether it's religion, whether it's race, whether it's income, that is the key to reducing bias. So I'd encourage y'all to read through this slide in the description, but then there's also 2 videos just to continue on with the New York Times example. And maybe Amy can show these, because I'm about to be late. But I'm just gonna go to one last thing to help you see that I always like tangible examples. So beyond just the kind of conceptual or watching clever videos about it, you think, well, that's fine, but does it actually work? So here's an example where it actually worked. So if we can, Corey, you mind grabbing those slides just so you can, oh, she's got it. There we go, it looks a little bit better. So the symphony, one of my favorite forms of leisure is listening to the symphony or the ballet, even better, because then you see the dancers. And if we always sit in the cheap seats up top so I can see who all's playing in the symphony, and now it's a little bit more diverse group. That wasn't always the case. If you Google symphony and you see some of the old black and white pictures, it was all old white men playing in the symphony. Every instrument, white men. And so some people, some directors of the biggest symphonies in the US wanted to reverse that. But it's kind of hard when people try out because they had always seen white men playing the instruments. They developed stereotypes about if you had the French horn, I think that's the one that loops a couple times. You know, you need your big chest and big lungs to be able to blow through that French horn and play it well. So we have stereotypes about who can play the French horn well or other wind instruments as well. So when the people would go out on stage, if they saw a man, and that was the linkage, remember in our brain that we talked about, the implicit prejudice and the implicit stereotypes that we have. We see that man with the wind instrument, we think, yep, that's a good match. We see a woman, let's say a small woman with the wind instrument, we may think, ooh, that's not who I think about with the wind instrument, and they were negatively impacted. So what could they do to reverse that? Any ideas about what they did?
Close their eyes.
Blind auditions.
Blind auditions. They could close their eyes or turn around. So now we have a TV show, The Voice, that mirrors all of this. But they put up a big screen. And then they also had them take off their shoes, because my shoes sound different than heels. And so it was as blind as they could get. And when they did that, it increased not only the number of women advancing to subsequent rounds, but also the overall diversity of the orchestra, especially in this case related to gender, and as time progressed related to race as well. So the folks who analyzed the data, their data set included 14,000 individuals. They found that when the screen was used, so the big screen for the decision makers couldn't see who it was, the women advanced from the preliminary round by 50% more than when the screen wasn't used. And rosters from the 11 major orchestras showed that the switch to blind auditions accounted for a 30% increase in new hires of women musicians. So that's a pretty substantial increase. And I mention that because the steps that they took to reduce their own biases, they were aware that the biases were there. They took steps to reduce it, and it resulted in change. And I think that we can do the same. I'll say we in this, because I think we all can continue to work on it. Continue to take steps in the choices we make every day, whether it's being a CASA, whether it's the people we hang around, whether it's the videos that y'all watch in a little bit. We can take steps to improve ourselves and reduce our biases as well. So with that, I'll let Amy take any questions you have. And I gotta actually run to pick up a swimmer who finishes at 7. So she lets me know when I am late, so I don't want to be too late.